can look at some of these great grand fantasy fiction masters, name two, whoever. And really, though, we're not any different. Anybody can try. And I'm not claiming about being as good as whoever. I'm talking simply about doing it at all. And I'm kind of rejecting the idea that there are the great, the great creators and then the great customers and then the massive customers. So the idea being that that initial surge that I had experienced in the late 70s to say, this could be done. We can do this, was recovered. So I was aiming at it from Sword and Sorcery. I was also, in the 90s, the whole thing of magic in the modern world. Holy shit, right? Now with 82 Netflix shows, available of the sort, it doesn't seem like such a thing. But in 1990, it was kind of exciting, right? And so the other thing to say is that a number of role-playing authors had certainly been in this frame of mind at least some of the time. Foremost among them was probably Greg Stafford of the Chaosium, who's the primary author of the setting called Glorantha, and has always been associated with the game RuneQuest and then various games, and is also tremendously well known for Pendragon and other games. Well, anyways, reading his work, especially back as a teenager, it was clear that somebody wanted to do this. So I found myself simply playing and playing and playing. A number of games had come out in the early 90s that helped me kind of break away from some procedural assumptions I had. And then there were some old games from the 70s, which had largely been forgotten, or at least I had experienced them as forgotten by everyone I met. And so therefore dipping back into those and saying I was really excited about those. Why? And trying to play some of them, trying to put in ideas. The idea being that I found that the concept of the demon binding relationship to be something that almost all role-playing games handled with extremely ginger touch. Extremely ginger.
Well, I was going to say the way I see it, there's two major steps you take away from classic, swords and sorcery, in that swords and sorcery was the sorcerers were always the baddies, and or at least generally. And in all role-playing games before, you talk about the context of the 80s and the 90s. There was the satanic panic and the kind of the cutting of all references to anything even vaguely construable as anything unsavory or occult from second edition D&D. And you charged in the opposite direction.
Well, there's a couple of things. First, I agree with you that there's several nuances here. One is that older fantasy fiction often dipped a very strong toe into interestingly looking at it from the other side. And that, as I argued actually in my Sorcerer supplement, that much of the classic kind of sword-wielding barbarian original fiction actually posited them as being rather good at the sorcery. And so that, we can go into this, but I have an argument in that supplement that Conan is actually a rather considerable sorcerer when he wants to be. And so you just have to read the stories by Howard and not get distracted by movies, among other things. So anyway, there's also some secondary characters throughout his fiction where the sorcerers are often quite appealing. And not just because they're good guys, because they're not, but they're appealing characters. The sort of stereotypical mumbo jumbo, jerk ass sorcerer isn't really very common in those stories across multiple authors. Not for Fritz Leiber, not for Clark Ashton Smith, not for C.L. Moore, not for a whole bunch of people. So I had sort of a literary backing. So that was part of me saying, how come those aren't in role playing particularly?
Mm.
Again, looking in some of the games, you can see echoes and hints. Some of the early D&D, the attention given to the demonic magic clearly was tempting at least someone in the authorship of those various parts. Um, and furthermore, the other games would dive into it a little bit more. But still, again, never accept as a piece of the magic. Now, the one big standout was the first version of Stormbringer, which was published in 1981. It was published by Chaosium. It was written by the author of another primary role playing game, Tunnels and Trolls, whose name was Ken St. Andre. And that was a game in which, the summoning of demons, the building of them as part of play, and the relationship basically being an ongoing thing, there was a solid core there to look at. And the books that it was based on, I was very deeply familiar with. And so, therefore, instead of me saying, oh, look, Stormbringer does it, I can do it too, it's more like that guy read those.
Mm.
I read those. Okay, I can go jump off with those and a bunch of other books as well, or other sources. Now, what's kind of interesting about the other part you said is that I actually missed the entire Satanic Panic
How's that?
because I'm too old.
Mm.
I turned 16 in 1980. By 1985, do you think I gave a shit what any adult said about anything I did?
Sure.
Right? And I was also, and this is a bit of that autobiography creeping in. Anybody, I apologize to you in advance. But I am from the extreme west coast of California, and my background includes both um, coming from a military family, but which blew apart during my first decade over the Vietnam War, and included a great deal of countercultural upbringing as well. You
Mm.
mentioned an organization that you were familiar with from the Chicago area. I could name drop here about a whole bunch of California phenomena right now that
Yeah.
spans quite a range of acceptable to mention in public and not acceptable to mention in public.
Yeah.
So I have a storied background across
Yeah.
the political and social spectrum of a very turbulent time, I might add.
Yeah.
So, anyway, with that background, let's just say that I'm disinclined to do confirmatory creative work. Right.
Um, how do you mean by confirmed?
What I mean is that in experiencing creative work or in performing it, that your sense of your values and particularly your place in the society you live in is confirmed.
Mm.
And
Mm.
so it was apparent to anybody, but most relevantly to myself, that by the time I was old enough even to have something like a bookshelf, that it was going to be populated by dissenting work.
Sure.
Whether ranging across deeply serious to deeply comedic, to ranging from very naturalistic to very fantastic, ranging from very old to very new. Right, but that was my interest. Um, Now, in that context, you may be interested to know. Therefore, so if you're 16, in 1980, and the D&D sort of moral crisis is still a few years It's not really going to kick in until you're in college, and having no interest in any contact with it whatsoever. Effectively, I missed it as a social phenomenon. The experiences of people confronting, their kids with this issue. I had experienced it to a much greater extent, interestingly enough, regarding comics, because the late 70s saw a wave of comic book burning that was associated with the rapid spread of evangelic Christianity in my region, very much straight out of Southern California. There's a long history about that I can go into, but basically, it went mainstream. So the upcoming success of Reagan's campaign for president, its base had made itself apparent to me in my face via all my friends and their families and their varying reactions to this. And I basically saw hippie Jesus who dropped acid turn in my face to American Jesus who drops bombs.
Mm.
And so that was very evident to me. So I had experienced that regarding comics, particularly the very, very trippy Marvel comics of the time. I did not experience it regarding role playing. What I experienced regarding role playing was, like me, a number of people who'd basically given up on it in high school, just as given up on it as a bad job. And then we found each other in college, and over the course of a number of years, we're like, wait a minute, I really always thought there was something in that. I'd like to do that again if I could find the right people, or similar phrases. And that's where I got started in role playing again, was finding people. But none of us cared a bit. We were, everything you've heard about that early 80s generation is true. We were extremely apocalyptic people, and our idea of having fun was, well, I'm just glad a number of us lived through it, basically.
Yeah.
And so, and I could go on. Remember, I'm the generation that is post pill, pre AIDS.
Mm.
I'm the generation. Just say no didn't become a slogan again until after I was finishing high school.
Sure.
So, yeah, the point being that the Satanic Panic had this tremendous effect across a number of communities of the United States, but I missed it. And I wasn't paying attention to role-playing culture, not even a little. The hobby as such, the industry, so-called, whatever. And so I never saw second edition Dungeons and Dragons. I didn't even see its run-up. I never read a Dragonlance book. So my interest in that material for Sorcerer was mainly looking at role-playing games of the 90s, and was mainly looking at the fiction of fantasy and finding it wanting. And then also my enjoyment of those specific characters across fantasy and mythology, going, all the way back to these really dark, we have terms for these now: villain, protagonist, anti-villain, stuff like that, weird things, whatever on earth Medea is doing.
So I guess kind of the way I see it with Sorcerer, you ultimately, and to set up any kind of game mechanics, you have to take some kind of stance. And you do that with the humanity mechanic, which is ultimately, I think, the kind of traditional religious stance. Or at least in the sense of you lose when you zero out on humanity.
The interesting issue. Yeah, go ahead.
And I don't know, within that lens, it's kind of if the goal of your game should be to keep humanity as high as possible, so you're better off just not playing the game.
I've heard that before.
But which, and I think I should put some distinctions on this, within, not necessarily within the notion of binding, which is kind of a more forceful thing, and that kind of has its own backgrounds in Renaissance and medieval texts, like more Solomonic
I
grimoires.
was going to say, I
Or
discovered later that it was deeply codified in the Ottoman Empire fantasy tradition.
huh,
Yeah, that's in fact, strangely enough, a great deal of D&D is actually Ottoman.
really?
Yeah. Well, they got it through the Brits,
Mm.
and the Brits got it from there. So, but anyway, that's just a footnote. I hear what you're saying. Let me know when you're gonna release me.
um, I don't know, but within, I don't know, I guess more of a sort of the Gnostic lens. It would be more something like, well, um, becoming something a bit more than human is or emptying yourself out is the goal. That's just a step on the course to enlightenment and becoming. And I know the language used frequently is a man of fire
Mm-hmm.
versus a man of clay.
If you look at the
Which would
history,
which would be a
well,
very different. Oh,
yeah.
sorry. Which would be a very different game, but it wouldn't have nearly, I think, as interesting a conflict.
In the case of that topic, I think that is actually the heart of the mid 90s role playing game called Nephilim. Nephilim is a game which the authors went to extraordinary pains to actually use, so the occult, and to basically get it right, to do all the occult stuff. So if anybody was actually really operating directly against the satanic panic, it was these guys. This was also from the Chaosium. These authors seem to, like, as with all Chaosium products, you sometimes kind of wonder, just how seriously are you taking this? Because it seems like you're taking it super seriously. But anyway, that's their business. But the point being that that's pretty much what they were about. You celebrated the entrance of the Nephilim, in the blend of the Nephilim and the human, and the basic subordination, really, of the human priorities in favor of these repeated lives and the larger picture, and the insights available and stuff. That's basically what play is. Um, Now, Sorcerer is a bit different, I think, even just from the obverse of that. Um, because I look at Sorcerer as more of the existential picture, which is less of, you know, a purpose to the cosmos does not exist, which is, I think, a clearer way than bibbling about godness. A purpose, right, of a point may not exist, but even if it did, so what?
Yeah,
What's that to me?
it's a
And
much more human,
that's the picture.
relatable
So
context.
it in that sense, we would ask then, what is humanity? Because if your initial phrasing was right, and Sorcerer was kind of on the side of the cosmos and its purpose, and all the game mechanics are basically about making a mistake, you can think of that as kind of the Faust model of Sorcerer literature. It's just a bad
Mm,
idea. Just don't do that shit. Right? Just don't do
yeah.
that. Whereas you also can look at other characters and other myths and other traditions of, of philosophical traditions, and say, how about the notion of, if something is right, and bearing in mind that you can arrive at being right through some sort of syllogistic process if you want, or you can arrive at being right simply by caring about it so much that you don't give a fuck about anything else. And before anyone criticizes either of those, I can say, yeah, but all the things that you call right, that's how you justify them.
Mm.
So, that's the point being, though, is that if you are committed to that, and then if the cosmos happens to differ with you, in
Then we have
this
a
case,
game.
yeah, then
Yeah.
then you say, And
Yeah.
and there's where the game is. And so humanity actually becomes a fairly interesting thing because one way there's two ways to diminish humanity in the game. One of them does correspond with that. The cosmos does push back, right? You can erase yourself effectively. Um, but that's not the main one. The main one is not the morality in the setting, but the morality among us at the table. And I am very, very interested in emergent and nonverbal effects around the table of role playing based on who happens to be playing this time. And although I put the judgment of whether to make a humanity gain roll or a humanity check, for potential for loss, I put that in the hands of the game master. But in many ways, I am saying it has to be in the hands of a human. And I will let the completely unconstructed, soft, unidentifiable interactions between that game master and all the other players in terms of what's right for this as we're looking at it right now. Where am I standing relative to this? How do I judge this? I'm willing to say, yeah, it's up to the game master, but only because that's very, very pragmatic to do that. And those influences of everybody else will still be there. So, in other words, I'm saying that instead of dealing with morality as it's relevant to binding demons, I'm much more interested in morality as it's relevant to fiction as such. And that's why I identify humanity as less of a um, good or badness. Okay, you're screwing up. Okay, you're getting better, right? With a dice mechanic. Instead, it's more of theme music.
Mm.